Part 1. You will hear a man and a woman discussing a place that treats injured sea creatures. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. You should answer the questions as you listen, because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
Hi, Jeremy. How are you?
Hello, Angela. I'm fine. I've just got back from a day in the country.
Where did you go?
To the Scottish Sea Life Sanctuary. A cousin of mine works there.
Oh, tell me all about it.
Well, first of all, it's situated on the shores of Loch Crieran and is surrounded by a forest. It really is the most picturesque setting. My cousin, Terry, works in the seal rescue facility there. That's where they take care of seals that need help. Mostly, they have pups there.
That's what a baby seal is called, isn't it?
Yes, some of them are there because they're sick or injured, and others have become separated from their mothers.
Are there many different kinds of seal there?
No, just 2, the grey seal and the common seal.
So, do their mothers simply abandon them sometimes?
Well, usually what happens is the pup runs into some kind of trouble. It could have been isolated from its parent due to stormy weather, for example. The sea can get quite rough in this part of the world. Sometimes such a pup will be found on a beach by someone who wants to help it and does so by taking it to a place like the Sea Life Sanctuary.
And that's how the pup is saved?
Actually, things are a little more complicated. Of course, many of the seals which are taken to the facility would most likely have died if they hadn't received any help. One such example is a seal named Blondie. She's a common seal that was found as a pup and taken to Suffolk Wildlife and Country Park. Blondie had been abandoned by her mother and needed a great deal of care. The staff in Suffolk couldn't help her, so she came north to Scotland. She's been there ever since.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
Isn't it usually the aim of this kind of place to reintroduce animals back into the wild?
Yes, but Blondie had got so used to humans it just wasn't possible in her case. There are a couple of other permanent residents like her there, but on the whole, what you said is true. The centre accepts between 12 and 15 pups annually, and the staff do their best to prepare them for life in the wild.
How do they do that?
Well, first they have to make sure they get enough to eat. The pups, which may be just a few days old when they arrive, are fed on a special mixture of milk and fish oil. As they get older, they are introduced to fish and then they have to learn to feed themselves. Once they can do this, they are moved to outdoor pools and are eventually set free.
I'd love to be able to help the centre.
Well, you could adopt a seal pup. It only costs £15. Or you could adopt one of the seals that live there permanently. That's a bit more expensive, £20 for a young seal and $30 for an adult.
I'd love to adopt a pup.
That is the end of part 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to part 2. Part 2. You will hear a man talking about a walking holiday in Tasmania. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15. Good evening. I'm very pleased to have been invited along to your club to talk to you about my experience of a walking holiday in Tasmania. On my first day there, while sitting on the finest, whitest sand, after half an hour of swimming in the clearest, calmest water I have ever seen, I recalled my anxiety on being told by my editor that I was being packed off on a walking holiday in the Tasmanian wilderness. Immediately, I had imagined aching feet, difficult climbs up muddy paths to reach high altitudes and sleeping in uncomfortable tents and huts. Then, once I had had a good look at the literature provided by the company that would be organising my tour, I realised that I was mistaken. The walks could all be completed by the reasonably fit. I also realised something else, just what Tasmania had to offer in terms of landscape. Not only does Tasmania contain Australia's largest expanse of temperate rainforest, these cover about 10% of the island, but more than a third of the island is protected within national parks and reserves. The dramatic landscapes that can be found there include mountain ranges, rainforests with their dark rivers, mountain lakes and miles of untouched coastline. With such diverse scenery in this ancient landscape, it's not surprising that the wildlife is just as varied. There are plants and vegetation that can be found nowhere else on the planet, as well as animals such as the wallaby, the platypus, and of course the most famous of all, the Tasmanian devil. My own Tasmanian adventure would take in a small area to the northwest of the island known as the Bay of Fires. This stretch of coastline is situated at the edge of the Mount William National Park and offers a dramatic landscape, dense woodland and fine white beaches. As we had been informed by our local guide, the wildlife here is diverse and fascinating. A visitor might see kangaroos, wombats, Tasmanian devils, and a large variety of seabirds. Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20. The first day of our walking tour was amazing. We began at Lizard Point, which offers stunning views north to the Bass Strait Islands. As we headed northeast along the cliff path, we saw beautiful, secluded beaches and enormous sand dunes. The walk was nothing like as demanding as I had feared. We had covered about 9 kilometres when we were told we were nearing Forester Beach Camp, our accommodation for that first night. Situated next to a splendid beach of pure white sand, the camp offers comfortable but basic accommodation. It is an ecologically friendly construction, so you can enjoy its comforts without feeling guilty about harming the environment. We travelled south the following day along the coastline. Again, there was a feeling of peace. All that could be heard was the cry of the seabirds overhead and the crashing waves. Our second and third nights were spent at the Bay of Fires Lodge, situated on a hilltop 40 metres above the sea. On day 3, we had a chance to explore the ecology of Anson's River in a canoe. As the water along the whole of this river system is calm, there was no need to be an experienced canoeist to participate. On our last day, we walked back to our starting point via a route which took us through forests and valleys. My walking tour of the Tasmanian wilderness had been a gentle and relaxing experience, and I had been lucky enough to see splendid, unspoiled scenery. That is the end of part 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to part 3. Part 3. You will hear 3 students and a professor discussing youth crime. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Right, I'd like to turn your attention to the handout you were given in our last lecture on antisocial behaviour orders, or ASBOs, as they are often referred to. The particular case I'm going to focus on involved a youth from Leeds who was given an ASBO after having defaced public property. So let's start off by discussing this case before we go into the wider issues. Tony, why don't you start by giving us your impressions?
I'd like to point out that this issue really captured the public's imagination. There was widespread media coverage of this case, including many debates on the issue on the net, with thousands of readers commenting on the story.
So we should focus on the appropriateness of the punishment, the ASBO in this instance. You don't look so convinced, Dave.
No, I can understand people getting worked up. I mean, it wasn't the boy's first offence. This was the 3rd time he had been caught vandalising public property. Not only that, but he'd also been warned on several occasions and had been arrested and put on trial for threatening behaviour the previous year.
I know a lot of people say we should be tough on crime, but I'd still say that they were right to punish him in this way. He is underage, after all.
You don't agree, Dave?
How on earth can a civil order be punishment enough for the distress caused by this young offender's conduct? He should have been punished properly the first time.
What is a proper punishment, though, Dave? It's not that simple an issue.
I'll tell you one thing. These ASBOs are far too lenient for my liking. They definitely don't act as deterrents, do they?
If the offender is named and shamed, they do. Since an ASBO comes under civil law, it means that the offender's details can be revealed.
Anna, let's have your views on this.
I can't agree with the name and shame principle. I don't believe many of these youngsters have much shame anyway. Otherwise, they wouldn't have committed the crime in the first place. In fact, they are more likely to see it as a badge of honor. I have to agree with Dave that the young offender in Leeds should have been dealt with more firmly the first time. Perhaps then he wouldn't have reoffended.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
Obviously you don't agree, Tony.
Well, I'm of the opinion that we should look at the causes and find out why juvenile offenders commit these minor crimes in the first place. We should bear in mind that many youngsters grow up in relative poverty and without a stable family nowadays. To me, criminal activity is really a cry for help. I firmly believe that a kind of meet their needs treatment would work much better.
I'm sorry, Tony, but that's far too idealistic. Plenty of crime is committed by those who want to acquire wealth or show off to their peers. As far as I'm concerned, the only need that young offenders have is the need for a short, sharp shock. If they know that they will spend some time in a youth detention center, then they might be put off breaking the law.
What? Put them under lock and key? That's a bit severe, isn't it, Dave? I agree with you that the law needs to get tougher the first time round to shock the offenders into staying on the straight and narrow. But prison? No, definitely not. They are minors, after all. There has to be a well-thought-out policy in these cases, and the circumstances of each case need to be taken into account.
That's exactly my point. I have my reservations about coming down too hard on young offenders, as I doubt whether this would make them turn over a new leaf. I'm sure that a counseling program would be far more effective. That would get to the bottom of what drives their delinquent behavior.
Dave?
What do you mean, Tony? Handle them with kid gloves? No way! And I'm sure that most taxpayers would feel the same about their hard-earned cash being spent on such soft treatment. Crime is a major concern nowadays, and not just in city centres. We can't just allow it to get out of control.
Although I believe that counseling might help a number of these youngsters, I feel it should happen in combination with stricter measures as well.
That is the end of part 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to part 4. Part 4. You will hear a talk by a professor on the world's first written language. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 and 32. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 and 32.
Today, I'm going to talk to you about the origins of writing. Cuneiform script, the world's first written language and one of the earliest known forms of expression, was created by the ancient Sumerians over 5,000 years ago. In its original form, it was a system of pictographs, in other words, pictures or pictograms resembling the objects they were supposed to represent were used. These were displayed in vertical columns, a sharpened reed being used to carve them onto tablets of clay. However, it still had to undergo further evolutions to become what we would term today a practical writing system.
Before you hear the next part of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 33 to 35. Now listen and answer questions 33 to 35.
Two important developments took place which made this writing process much easier. Although symbols still had to be carved into stone or clay tablets, a new organizational approach was introduced. For example, people began to inscribe the pictographs in straight rows from left to right, the way we write today in the Western world. The second key development was the introduction of a differently shaped pen. This had a wedge-shaped tip, which was pushed into the wet clay, producing wedge-shaped symbols. It is from these that this form of writing gets its name, The Latin cuneus means wedge. In addition, the pictograms became more abstract over time. An object such as a fish had originally been depicted as a simple, fairly realistic pictogram showing the outline of this animal. With the introduction of horizontal writing, this had been upended. In other words, the same design, but as though the fish was standing on its tail. Then, when the new wedge-shaped stylus began to be used, a more abstract depiction developed.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 36 to 40. Now listen and answer questions 36 to 40.
As I already said, clay tablets were the primary media for written communications. These were usually recycled, with the exception of cases where permanence was called for and then they would be baked in a kiln. These clay tablets were widely used in schools where a convex-shaped tablet which could easily fit into the palm of the hand was popular. One of the surviving round school tablets recovered by archaeologists from the ancient Babylonian city of Nippur has 4 rows on the front of the tablet. The first 2 rows have been inscribed by the teacher and the student has copied the inscriptions on the 3rd and 4th rows. It can be safely assumed that this was a handwriting and vocabulary lesson. Tablets were not only used by school children, of course. They were also commonly used to document economic activities. Prior to 3000 BC, tokens had been employed, each one representing a different item. These were initially made from stone and later from clay. There would be a specific token for jugs of wine, sheep, and so on, and these tokens would actually be stored in a container as a record of amounts. Around 3000 BC, however, these tokens became obsolete as scribes became central figures in keeping economic records. They utilized a complex system whereby the tokens were replaced by pictographs on wet clay. Rather than indicating, for instance, 4 jugs of wine by using 4 separate tokens or 4 separate pictograms, they instead used the relevant symbol once and next to it the symbol denoting the number 4. This led to the development of a system for designating numbers. At the same time, symbols were developed on a phonetic basis. This meant that it wasn't only concrete items that could be indicated in written communication, but names and, over time, more sophisticated concepts. This breakthrough made the recording of stories a possibility.
That is the end of part 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.